listener production.
Hi, Natarsha Belling with you, and welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, it's on. After months of speculation, Angus Taylor will challenge Sussan Ley tomorrow morning for the Liberal leadership. So who is Angus Taylor, and will a change in leader really save a party in crisis? Those details in just a moment. But first, let's check the afternoon headlines this Thursday, the 12th of February. Only 4 of the 19 Closing the Gap targets are on track to be met ahead of the 2031 deadline. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese today tabling the annual report on progress under the National Agreement on Closing the Gap. The PM admitting failure is not an option and we must do better.
We are now 5 years away from most of the target deadlines. We are clear about where there is more to do. We must also guard against talk of failure, because talk of failure dismisses the aspirations and achievements of Indigenous Australians. It ignores the leaders and communities who are changing lives. Failure is a word for those who have stopped trying or given up listening. I make this clear today. I am not contemplating failure. Our government is not contemplating failure.
Mr Albanese also announced a number of new funding packages aimed at improving Indigenous health, remote jobs, short-term housing, food security and domestic violence programs. RBA Governor Michelle Bullock has fired back at a coalition senator who accused her of gaslighting the Australian public over the state of the Australian economy. National Senator Matt Canavan lashing out at the RBA boss during a Senate estimates hearing into the reserve.
People are only going to get angrier in this country if they're gaslit into thinking that the economy is okay when their lived experience is absolutely terrible.
Senator,
right
I take exception to that comment. I am not
as I have taken
gaslighting anyone.
Okay.
Let us speak.
I have said that there are certain aspects of the economy which are doing well, and one of them is the labour market, which is positive for people. Now, I understand that some people are doing it tough. I do understand. I get letters and I read them. But that is not to say that you can't recognise that there are some parts of the economy that are doing well. And the labour market, I think, has been a really positive thing for this country.
The RBA lifted the official cash rate earlier this month after higher than expected inflation data. And New South Wales Premier Chris Minns has refused to apologise to the Muslim community after a group of people praying were forcibly removed during a pro-Palestinian rally on Monday night. A number of Muslim groups, including the Australian Federal Imams Council, Australian National Imams Council and the Lebanese Muslim Association, called on the Premier and the New South Wales Police Commissioner to apologise after video of the incident went viral. It's understood the Police Commissioner has apologised, but the Premier is standing firm. Now it's time to get into our deep dive on the Liberal leadership spill with Katina Curtis, political reporter with the West Australian at Parliament House in Canberra. Tomorrow morning, the Liberal Party will meet for a party room vote with Angus Taylor challenging Sussan Ley. The party is also set to choose a new deputy, but many are asking, will the leadership shake-up be too little too late? With Conservative power broker James Patterson today admitting if it goes on, there will be nothing left of the Liberal Party at the next election. Katina, thanks so much for joining us. Well, finally, after weeks of speculation, some people may say months of speculation, it is on. The leadership spill will happen tomorrow morning. Unpack it for us, exactly what will happen around 9 a.m. tomorrow morning.
Yes, as you say, this has dragged on for some weeks now of the really heightened speculation about what will happen. But finally, late last night, Angus Taylor resigned from the front bench, and then that obviously cleared the way for him to openly canvass for the leadership. And his supporters lodged a letter this morning with Sussan Ley and the Chief Opposition Whip, Aaron Violi, calling for that special meeting to be held. The timing of the meeting was in Sussan Ley's hands. I did hear from from some of the Taylor camp that they wanted a meeting to be held as soon as possible, perhaps later tonight, but it's been set down for 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, which is kind of the most sensible thing because there's still Parliament going on today, and perhaps the most complicating factor is there's still Senate estimates. So all the senators are actually tied up in committee rooms until about 11 o'clock tonight asking questions of all the bureaucrats. So that was kind of complicating. But yes, 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, it's on. The numbers are really quite tight in the party room. Taylor's camp is confident that they will be 4 or 5 votes ahead when it comes to it. But, it was a very narrow win by Sussan Ley last year. The numbers have shifted a little bit because of the composition of the Senate changed after that vote was taken. And they've obviously got a couple people who are sort of in the centre and maybe not rusted onto one camp or the other. Just does sound like they've flipped. There's also actually quite interestingly opening up to be quite a wide contest for the deputy leadership position as well. You might remember when the coalition was in government and they kept changing Prime Minister, Julie Bishop lasted through as the deputy Liberal leader to Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull. That was because she always took the position that a spill of the leadership didn't automatically mean a spill of the deputy leadership. But they are calling for both positions to be gone tomorrow. It's sounding like Ted O'Brien probably not going to end up holding on to his job. But there's quite a wide field of contenders, including the Senator, Jane Hume. Would be pretty unusual to have a deputy come from the Senate, but she's in the mix. Zoe McKenzie, who's from Victoria. Melissa Price from WA has said she's thinking she'll put her hand up. And we've also got Melissa McIntosh and Dan Tehan and Tim Wilson thinking that they would like to be in the mix as well. So that actually is probably the more unpredictable bit of all of that. Angus Taylor isn't running on a ticket with anyone like he did with Jacinta Nampijinpa Price last May.
The big question is, some are even saying this is just shuffling the chairs or the deck chairs on the Titanic. How important is this change in a leader? Can Angus Taylor save the Liberal Party, which is in absolute crisis?
Yeah, they're in such dire straits that it really is incredibly hard to see how a shake-up will, how things can change without some kind of radical change. It really is. I thought Angus Taylor in his press conference last night, he didn't articulate any specific policies. Compare that with Peter Dutton in 2018 when he said he'd run against Malcolm Turnbull as Prime Minister at the time. At least he had this suggestion that, he wanted to take the GST off electricity bills. Like it wasn't a massive policy, but at least it was an idea. Angus Taylor talked about the need for strong leadership, for clear vision, and for courageous pursuit of Liberal values, though he didn't kind of explicitly state what those values were. But he didn't, he was asked about policy proposals and he didn't detail anything. Probably have heard some better articulation of the argument for change from some of his allies today, particularly James Paterson, who's a fairly key figure in all of this, but not from him himself. So I think he really does need to work on that sales pitch to Australians to explain why the change is needed, how the Liberals will actually do better, what the policies are about helping them and why this wasn't just about fighting amongst themselves. And I think that he's probably going to fight an uphill battle to do that because there's some, he's been around politics for quite a while now, since 2013. Like there's some pretty rusted on views of him. He's had some fairly foot in mouth moments. And, you look on his social media posts, every social media post is just flooded with comments quoting that infamous Facebook comment that he made on his own post about, fantastic, great move, Angus, well done. That's just like, that's sort of out there in the zeitgeist. And that's one of the few things that I think just ordinary Australians who don't pay close attention to politics know about Angus Taylor.
Policies are critical, especially in turning it around for the Liberal Party. Let's unpack now who Angus Taylor is. We know he is from regional New South Wales. We know he was the Shadow Treasurer. He went to the University of Sydney. I believe also is incredibly well qualified with a number of economic degrees. But do you think he can lead?
Look, he looks like a Liberal, right? When you think of who is a Liberal politician, he sort of has that look. He's a bloke, which sadly will count for some, with quite a number of particularly the party's base and where it is at the moment. But he didn't come out of being shadow treasurer and necessarily looking all that great. The stories that have come out, particularly around that decision to oppose the tax cuts that the government put in the budget just before the election last year, he was really central in saying, let's oppose those tax cuts and even let's promise to repeal them. So that, for the first time ever, the Liberals went into an election promising higher taxes. Labor made hay with that. Also, when the coalition showed its books during the election campaign, which Angus Taylor was in charge of, they were promising higher deficits in the short term, which is also, again, an extraordinary position, even though they kept saying we've got to cut public servants, got to cut all of this spending. It was going to be higher deficits. And the other thing, the attack lines from the government have been really strong on that, particularly Jim Chalmers just takes aim, and Angus Taylor, he took him on as the treasurer in shadow, and for 3 years in the last term, he's still having whacks at him almost daily in question time. And before that, of course, when actually in government, Angus Taylor was the energy minister under Scott Morrison, and that also leaves ample space, I guess, for criticism of his record, particularly the thing that came out just after Labor took office, that Angus Taylor had signed this executive order to delay the release of large price hikes in electricity bills so that the numbers didn't actually come out till after the election, when it would be Labor's problem and not the coalition's to deal with.
There is some speculation that Angus Taylor was forced into this leadership spill and maybe he wasn't ready, because we know the main contenders to take out Sussan Ley were Andrew Hastie and Angus Taylor, and that he was almost forced into this position. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think the timetable's certainly moving faster than he would like, and particularly one of the things that's been said over and over from a number of people who do support Sussan Ley at this stage, but that they really feel that she should have been given at least 12 months, right? And she should have been given the chance to give a budget reply, which would happen in May. So that'd be around the 12-month mark, and see if things turn around. We heard that from Andrew Bragg this morning, who's a moderate senator from New South Wales. But he is sort of one of the ones that's regarded as, perhaps given time, could have been persuaded to change his allegiance. So there is this sense that had they waited longer, that perhaps they could have even got a more, the margin might not be so tight in the party room. They could have got a more decisive victory for Angus Taylor and kind of had more proof points to say that Sussan Ley's, things aren't recovering. Because I think we've seen as well, really, yes, the polls are dire, but we've had one poll, the trajectory's been downwards, but there's been so much infighting. There's been the Nationals blowing up the coalition, which had nothing to do, it wasn't Sussan Ley's fault that David Littleproud decided to walk away from the coalition, and all of that infighting is widely acknowledged that that's what's tanked the polls. So it is a little bit seizing the opportunity, but I do think there is a sense that they wanted to wait longer. I think Andrew Hastie was more impatient for this, but then obviously got told, it's not your turn, you're younger, it's Angus's time now. He has to have a crack now or he'll never get a chance.
And in regards to how you think this is going to play out for the female vote, we already know historically, especially in the last couple of elections, the female vote deserted the Liberal Party. Many people then voted for Teals or independents. How do you think this will be seen for female voters in regards to Sussan Ley never had a chance from the outset? From the moment that she started, there's been a lot of clear evidence she was being knifed from within her own party.
Yeah, I'm sure it's not going to play very well, though one of Taylor's supporters said to me this morning, he said, we've already lost 1 million voters since the last election and she was our leader. So how can you say there's a gendered lens on this? But I'm sure that there would be a lot of female voters who are women out there who would empathise with the situation, feeling undermined at work or feeling like there's some bloke who wants to come along and take credit for the hard work that you've done or the effort you've put in. And there was such a fuss made about the fact that she is the first female leader. We haven't even seen the election review from the Liberal Party yet. You know, that was supposed to be published before Christmas, but sort of the combination of the shooting in Bondi and also there's some legal threats being tossed around about that. So we haven't seen that published yet. But the election review from 3 years ago laid out really clearly the need to start having targets or quotas, can't mention the Q word to the Liberals, but, you know, having targets for women being pre-selected, setting up some kind of network to really kind of help boost up women from the grassroots up in the party. And not much of that work got done. So female voters further turned away from the party. I think you could argue that they didn't have the policies that put towards that. We saw the numbers of women amongst their parliamentary ranks slashed even further, partly just because they've got so few seats these days anyway. But I think, you know, I've just sat through question time. We had Catherine King go on the attack about how you boost gender equality in workplaces. And she was saying, really, like, it's been hard work for Labor. Now they're more than 50% women in their party room. And the difference that's made to the types of policies that they brought forward, we've seen a lot of things like around childcare, around women's health, both, you know, sort of fertility and also in the menopause space. And those kinds of policies really, there's a strong sense from Labor that you get those types of policies when you have a large number of women in the room around the cabinet table, and the Libs can't say that they've got that at the moment, and they don't have much prospect of that in the future. So I think it's the leadership factor will be part of it, but they've got to think really hard about the policies that they're presenting as well.
He certainly will have a difficult job ahead of him if he wins tomorrow. Thanks so much for joining us, Katina. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
That was Katina Curtis, Canberra Bureau Chief with The West Australian. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'll be back in your feed tomorrow morning with a deep dive on the new Wuthering Heights film. And we'd love you to subscribe or follow us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. I'm Natarsha Belling. Thanks for your company.